The government has been accused of ignoring community leaders over growing calls to reinstate the mandatory cashless debit card. A trial of the program saw recipients of JobSeeker and other welfare payments have a large portion of their payments quarantined onto the card, preventing the money from being spent on products like alcohol. That scheme was in place across 5 regions, but was wound up in October, from which point recipients were allowed to opt in. Those who were on the cashless debit card and chose not to continue are instead being moved to enhanced income management measures. That's despite anger from some regional communities who blame the removal of the card for a return of alcohol-related violence. Let's bring in the Shadow Health Minister Anne Ruston, who joins me live from Adelaide and did have responsibility for this area when in government recently. Anne Ruston, thanks for your time. Let's start with this enhanced income management. Will that be enough to replace the cashless debit card and help provide some equilibrium in these communities?
Well, the big issue here is that the new advanced card that they're calling is exactly the cashless debit card. There is no change at all. So this idea that the government has abolished the cashless debit card is nothing more than a complete distortion of the truth. But the challenges that we have is that the government also made the cashless debit card and this new advanced management card voluntary in those 5 sites that you mentioned in your introduction. The only place that income management remains compulsory is in the Northern Territory. And so those communities, those 5 communities that particularly 4 of them are calling out at the moment, or sort of 3 of them are definitely calling out at the moment for the reintroduction of income management, we have no access unless somebody voluntarily wants to go on the card. And this is where we're seeing these terrible scenes coming out of Laverton and Kalgoorlie and Ceduna and up in the northern part of Western Australia, where getting this really bad antisocial behaviour that is devastating communities again.
Can we just pick up on something you said earlier, though? So the enhanced income management, as it's called by the government, that's exactly the same card as the cashless debit card. There's just a renaming of the program. Is that right?
Absolutely. And when I questioned the government about this in estimates a couple of weeks ago, they actually admitted that people who currently have a cashless debit card in the Northern Territory won't even have their bank account number changed. It's exactly the same bank account that is going. The number still, the banking, the deposit taking institution is still in due, exactly the same as it was with the cashless debit card. And in the case of those people that get their card through the traditional credit union in the Northern Territory, they won't even have their card changed. So it is just completely and utterly misleading to say the cashless debit card has been abolished, but it has been ripped out of communities outside of the Northern Territory, made voluntary, where most people have come off the card. And this is where we're seeing this heightened level of antisocial behaviour and alcohol-fuelled violence.
So that's the key move, that it's been made voluntary as of October last year. I've spoken to a number of locals and other representatives from Laverton and the goldfields in WA, but you're saying it's also showing up in those other communities that we mentioned at the start of this story, like Ceduna.
Absolutely, and I was just speaking to the ex-mayor of Ceduna earlier today because I try and check in with them just to hear on the ground what's really going on and visit as often as I can. And he said that the local hotel has now had to have significantly heightened security because they're finding that people are going into the hotel and they're fighting and being aggressive towards other patrons. I mean, it is really, really sad. But we've got a government. I mean, we had a minister a couple of weeks ago, the Assistant Minister, Emma McBride, speaking on radio and actually telling factually incorrect. So, I mean, I don't know whether she was lying or she was misinformed or she hadn't done her homework, but we really do need the government to actually go into these communities, listen to what they're saying, because the card was put into these communities at the community's request. This wasn't something that was imposed on them by somebody else. The communities actually asked for this card, and now it's been taken away. We have, unfortunately, this violence and antisocial behaviour has re-emerged, which was the very reason the card was put there in the first place.
Are those representatives seeing a contradiction in what the government did very quickly, to its credit, in when it became that national story and front page headlines, the crime wave in Alice Springs, the Prime Minister was there within days, but you're saying as a result of the government's own policy that dysfunction has emerged because this thing has been made voluntary, and this is as a direct result of the federal government's own approach.
Look, absolutely. And, you know, what I'd say to the Prime Minister and the Minister, particularly the Minister for Social Services, is actually get out into the communities and spend some time actually listening to them. Don't just fly in and fly out for 3 minutes, which is what we've seen, both the Prime Minister and Minister Rishworth do in some of these communities. Actually get out there, stay overnight, see what happens after dark. Go out with the patrols and see the level of violence. Go and see the kids that are wandering around on the streets, because your policies have actually exacerbated this problem. Because as you rightly pointed out,
the government says,
in Alice Springs,
the government says though that these problems have been there for years. What do you say just directly to that these problems have been a big part of those communities for a lot longer than what we're talking about since October of last year?
The challenges that we're talking about were really, really extreme prior to the introduction of the cashless debit card. And you've only got to go out and actually speak to the people in the communities and have a look at the statistics around, the incidences of kids turning up to school having had their breakfast, the incidents of domestic violence and the like. They were significantly decreased when the card was in place, and almost overnight when the card came out of these communities, we've seen an escalation in this kind of behaviour. And it's tragic to see not only the people who are impacted by this, but it's the children wandering around the streets at night. It's the children who aren't going to school or who are going to school hungry. These are the consequences if you don't put in place things that will help support the community support itself.